Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I just appreciate just Rich giving us the opportunity to spend a little time today. And I know both Russell and I have had a lot of opportunities over the years working in the healthcare space. And in fact, a little known story about 20 some years ago, although we work together, all the time now, we actually really got to know each other and met preparing for a healthcare summit just like this. So it feels kind of nostalgic to have a chance to talk to everybody here today as well. So Russell, as always, great to be together and chat this way.
Yeah.
What I'll just go ahead and kick us off, and then we'll maybe kind of go back and forth and just some things we wanted to talk about today. As Rich mentioned, one of the things that we've worked a lot in healthcare, both from the clinical side and insurance side, and a couple other perspectives there, it has been the risk side of things, or really just using risk management principles to try to understand what are those things that we believe organizations can do to actually be effective. Russell and I both had a chance to work on the CIS controls project together for quite a few years, as well as some other projects as well, working together at CRF today as well. But the questions come up is, how do organizations, especially in healthcare, start to look at these trends, look at all the new technologies that are coming out, and still decide, are we adequately addressing the risk facing organizations? If things change, do we need to do things different? So maybe, Russell, maybe what I'll do is let me kick a couple questions over to you, and then maybe we can go back and forth a little bit here. But if you look at healthcare and you're thinking about, the way healthcare is facing some of the threats that we see out there today, especially as it relates to other industries. What are the things that you're seeing right now? Are you seeing healthcare being sort of in a unique space? Do you see them, addressing some similar threats, similar attacks? What are you seeing that you can share with the folks today?
Yeah, it is great to be here, everybody. And I think, if I go back in my timeline, I was happy to work for 13 years at Blue Cross Blue Shield, Tennessee, and never forget kind of checking that box and going to my first SANS class way back in 2003, and kind of building on that and getting involved in there. If at that time on healthcare financing, but understanding that, and a lot of family members work in healthcare. But you think about, with the healthcare clients we work with, even today, James, the ones where they literally, support doctors and nurses and technicians and surgeons and just people that are, literally saving lives and extending lives in healthcare. And that's definitely has been, and rightfully so should be, the priority for those cyber professionals in that area, supporting those, making things available, but also making them secure, and sometimes in life or death situations. And that prominence of, life safety, health, wellness, extending lives, saving lives, it's always has been, and rightfully so, in that industry, number one in that priority. And oftentimes what we see is the cyber professionals that we work with day in, day out, oftentimes when they're able to better understand, or maybe go to a surgery, or shadow someone in the emergency room or intensive care, understanding that and seeing the intersection of how having at their fingertips diagnoses, allergies, medical histories, and things, to be able to make sure that they're given that world class healthcare, definitely is something that we see very prominent, and where cybersecurity folks can understand and put into context the why behind the what, if you will, for how what they do contributes, maybe in a small way, but definitely does contribute to that life safety mission. I think that alignment is showing that has been something with that, happy to see. And intuit is not intuitive, but certainly is a means to better understand and see our role and our place in healthcare environments. Do you see similar things, James? Is that what you see with your clientele, or any different experience than what I shared?
Well, I mean, when I first started in healthcare, I mean, our background is probably a little bit different, right? You were probably more the insurance side, although it's only these days I feel like probably I'm doing a little bit more with insurance groups. But I feel like in those early years, especially, we spent a lot of time on the clinical side, and I'm always torn because there's a part of me that says, at the end of the day, healthcare is like everybody else, right? If I look at the corporate side of healthcare, there's a side of me that says, well, at the end of the day, we've got Windows machines, Windows 11 boxes we're defending. We've got cloud service providers we're defending. We've got Office 365 clients, tenants we're defending. And I mean, a lot of the same stuff you'd find at a bank, or you'd find at the Federal Reserve, or you find at, other clients that we're out there, they're working with. So like, there's this part of me that says, honestly, they're not much different than what we see in other places. And I look, but on the flip side, I sort of say, well, but at the same time, I look at systems like, radiology PACS platforms, or I look at, some of these cardiology systems that people are using, or whatever it might be. And part of me says it's almost like healthcare is sort of this blend of traditional corporate environments, sort of with a little bit of OT or SCADA systems sort of thrown in. And I know some people are sort of a little hesitant to say that these are necessarily SCADA platforms per se, but it definitely has that OT vibe to them. And I'm seeing a lot of folks that are sort of treating their, again, a PAC system just like they would, let's say, part of an energy grid, right? Maybe they talk about defending in similar ways, keeping it off networks or having isolated systems in place, or those kinds of things. So I'm torn. There's a part of me that says, I guess if I was to really prioritize defenses, I would say, let's look at these systems as if they're any other organization. Is ransomware any scarier in healthcare than it is in a bank? Probably not.
Yeah.
Probably going to use a lot of those same attacks. But at the same time, though, look at the OT side of it. I almost want to see them maybe take more of an OT perspective for that part of the network, but then treat themselves the same on the rest.
Yeah, that's a great point. As you think about OT, you think about power, the reason we have internet and connecting and have this conversation now. And I've not seen a significant focus in healthcare environments. I mean, we work with university systems, major healthcare companies, or on the delivery side and on the insurance side, like you said before. But I don't see that expertise or someone who is really good at or has done things in OT to bring that mindset, to bring that thought into healthcare, like perhaps we should.
Yeah, and I guess and maybe the elephant in the room too is just, I hate to say it, but physicians. We know how important they are. We know especially on the clinical side, we know that you can't have a clinical facility without physicians, and frankly, not just from an operational standpoint, but frankly, you're not going to have patients, right, if they don't give referrals. And so there's certainly a financial aspect to that too. But I would always caution people in those spaces, listen, if you're going to be dealing with folks like that, don't forego hygiene because you're trying to make a subset of your population happy. And I know they're vocal, I know they're important, but boy, make sure you understand what those hygiene principles are, kind of no matter who you are. But certainly in healthcare, and definitely physicians sort of like to push that boundary a little bit and maybe push back on some of those things we would consider traditional.
Yeah. And understanding that, but then how do you, from a risk perspective or a GRC perspective, how do you account for that? Or do you accept the risk for that? Or maybe, hey, I don't see anything and we'll kind of ignore that. Might be a more common response than perhaps it'd be in a corporate environment where uh, less flexibility, less power structure, maybe.
Fair. Well, I mean, we've got a couple of things maybe to talk about here too this morning. Let me sort of maybe pivot us a little bit. What are you seeing? I know healthcare has been sort of one of the organizations that really from the beginning has been regulated, maybe I say more and less than most, more in the sense that it's been regulated probably the longest, right, compared to other industries. But I know a lot of those regs have been sort of light over the years too. But certainly there's been sort of an increasing number of standards to consider, some that are healthcare specific, some that are healthcare adjacent that facilities have to deal with. And maybe it's even things that are sort of not traditional healthcare regs, but still might be applicable. I mean, how are you seeing organizations handle that today? That multitude of frameworks and sort of keeping all the regulators happy at the same time.
Yeah, definitely. When you think about HIPAA, remember when it came way back in memory banks again, 1996, then President Bill Clinton signed that into law. And then from a privacy security perspective, understanding that. And then several years after that, version two, if we'll dare to call it that, concepts of meaningful use and not just feeling like I've done good at healthcare, EPHI security, but some steps to kind of show that progression. And now, as we're thinking of, okay, well, what is potential? And some of the healthcare clients are kind of refreshing on the Federal Register to see when will a new iteration on that standard be. What we see more than ever is it's not just I'm a healthcare organization, therefore I do HIPAA, but I'm a healthcare organization. And I'm publicly traded, and our company takes credit cards, and so many diverse set of compliance requirements at a minimum to say, what laws do we need to follow? What obligations have our organization made? And then finally, you mentioned earlier the hygiene areas. What are at least the basic hygiene things? What are the things that we as a cybersecurity professional know to do and things that are most important? How do we make sure that we're accounting for all of those? So again, that collection of different areas, not just what does HIPAA say, but so many more regulations and requirements are in place, or could be they want to work with DoD or support their mission again. So CMMC would come in. So several places of that host of regulations, and then trying to make sense of HIPAA says this, and Another PCI regulator might say that, but trying to collect that and understand those obligations definitely is what we're seeing. And then the challenge of that, okay, that's really hard. Do I silo HIPAA over here? Do I silo credit cards over there? Do I silo the SEC regulations over there? Or more commonly, what we see is that collection of here's the things that we need to do. And in many cases, covering those bases across the entire enterprise. That's what I've been seeing there, James.
No, that's fair. I always worry. I'm always hesitant to even say this. I know both of us have been sort of watching HIPAA for a million years, and I remember back in the day with SANS, right? I know I did the road show, sort of helping explain HIPAA to people back in the late '90s, early 2000s, and it was great at the time, right? It filled the gap that no other industry really had, right? We had maybe a couple, like maybe you had some of the FISMA stuff that was about that same year, the Sarbanes-Oxley stuff that came out that same year, or at least enforceable in 2002 and such. But I've always got this worry that, especially with healthcare, that HIPAA was this bar that everyone had sort of looked at, and everyone used HIPAA as a hammer for so long to say, listen, we've got to do this because HIPAA said we had to do this thing. But then people started to realize the bar, frankly, wasn't as high as maybe it could have been. And I wonder sometimes if maybe healthcare even has struggled because of that, or maybe some of the healthcare clients we've dealt with that maybe they're falling behind a little bit because they've really kept that standard to be the low bar, rather than looking at maybe some of the more hygiene things that you mentioned, or maybe some of the higher standards that could be out there. How are you seeing organizations handle that? Are you seeing some of the healthcare clients you're working with, sort of address things, say, hey, HIP is fine as a starting point, but we've got to move on to something more? Or how are you seeing people handle that?
Yeah, and I know one thing you talk about there is kind of the popularity contest, kind of like which framework is the most popular one. Now, NIST CSF pretty popular because it's only a little bit over a year old, and so a lot of attention is going in that direction. But you think about, when was the last time HIPAA was updated? I mean, a
Yeah,
long 15, 16, 17 years ago, and it's important that was made. But what's changed in cybersecurity the last 10 years, even like everything. You mentioned ransomware and where place examples where maybe see it in Stan's news bites, maybe work in other scenarios where we see, because of ransomware, life was lost, or because of ransomware, had to go to the manual operation mode for maybe folks on ventilators or folks in operating rooms. So that impact of maybe following very dated regulations, and then having the impact to the ability of the organization to fulfill their mission of saving lives and extending lives. And so I think this idea of how can organizations be mindful of that, again, that connection, or like what you say in your SANS class, that lineage of how cyber helps healthcare systems deliver their mission. Not just I do cyber because I've been to a SANS class, I do cyber because that's all I know to do, but contextually helping to increase the odds that the company can achieve its goals and decrease the odds that life would be lost. I mean, again, kind of what hangs in the balance when we do cyber well enough. Organizations that I see, professionals that I see succeeding in healthcare are ones who are, again, mindful of the mission, not in a subservient task, not like the opposite of the doctor's ego example you gave before, but that awareness of the contribution that's there and necessary, and more times than not, has to look at other collections, such as what does NIST say collection, or what does ISO say collection, to not just kind of race to the bottom for, with all due respect to HIPAA, kind of racing to the bottom of those minimum requirements, but what are those things that we know to do, and how do we talk and communicate that to medical professionals and hospital executives, and helping them kind of weigh the risk of to do a good thing or to accept the risk of not doing that good thing is what I say, James.
yeah, no, that's totally fair. I've been encouraged. I think, if you had asked me this 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have been this encouraged. But I feel like the last couple of years, it's almost like there's this sense. I don't know if you see this too, but I feel like there's a sense that people are starting to figure out that we kind of know what we need to do. Like, it's not a mystery, right? It's not wizardry anymore. Like, we have a plan. And I know some of the work we've been doing at the Cybersecurity Risk Foundation, and looking at aggregating some of these libraries against each other. I know one of the things that sort of caught me. So for those of you who haven't seen that project, I definitely would encourage you to check it out. Again, Cybersecurity Risk Foundation at crfsecure.org. But one of the things that we did over there, and we've been sort of doing this maybe 5 or 10 years now, is taking a lot of these different standards. And some of the work that we originally worked on was trying to just map things. And so we were taking things from like Center for Internet Security and other places and just mapping them all together. But one of the things we started to see is we started to aggregate these models, again, whether it be HIPAA, like Russell mentioned, the NIST CSF, or some of the new things they've done there, or the ISO standards, some of that. What we started to find was there's definitely overlap in what people were saying. And it was kind of nice to see that it wasn't just just one group saying, hey, do this, that everyone's sort of in agreement, these are the things that we know we can do. And I think by seeing that, I guess I've felt encouragement that we do know what needs to happen for us to be successful. And it's been nice to sort of get that sense in talking to companies about that. The other thing that sort of caught my eye, I guess, as we were releasing, I think it was a 2024, the 2025 version of the CRF safeguards, is I remember noting that almost none of the new standards that had come out were really asking anybody to do anything different at all. I think the only one that really sort of caught my eye, whatever the year was NIST 800's 172, and the new things they were doing to add on top of CMMC level 3 things. And there was like maybe 1 or 2 statements about deception management, and maybe a couple of things that maybe really weren't talked about in other standards. But that was meant, 172 was meant to be kind of a high bar kind of a statement there. And I guess I kind of have the sense that I like this idea that we at least know what the target state should be. So as healthcare organizations are looking at what should I be putting into place, they have some of these libraries that they can go back to. And certainly the CRF safeguards has aggregated quite a few. I think we're up to like 80 or 90 different standards sort of pulled together in that space. But yeah, there's definitely tools available. I like that. I like that there's maybe hope that people don't have to reinvent the wheel. And speaking of that, I know one of the other projects sort of near and dear to your heart there is the GRC roadmap that we've been working on here the last year or two, trying to put together some maybe more concrete steps for organizations looking to operationalize these things. First of all, I guess maybe before we get into some of that, how are you feeling about organizations operationalizing safeguards? Do you feel like the organizations you're working with have good governance structures in place? Is that something you're seeing healthcare companies need to improve, or how are you seeing that?
I think again, it's just like we talked about the toolkit of CSF version 2 with govern. If I was in charge, and a lot of reasons I'm not in charge of NIST, I would want to call it governance or program management, how to run your security program. But I'm not in charge of NIST for all kinds of reasons. But I think as you think about these, I didn't think about how important it is to have the discipline of program managers or project managers or risk management as a silo or a container of here's things under that category, other categories that are their security policies. I mean, most people don't have a great joy in security policies, but again, it contributes to the overall parent of govern or governance, and doing it not because you have time or you run out of things to do or your meetings, you don't have meetings on Friday for some reason, but doing those things on purpose and with a purpose to serve the overall delivery of cybersecurity, to make sure that you don't do too much or too little, but just enough cyber for your healthcare delivery system. I think is a key idea, is to be more intentional, and I think that that's one of the great things that NIST has done, is invited us to consider, hey, the importance of that. Even in the logo, kind of in the middle there, and it's really important, and it touches and enables us to identify, protect, detect, respond, recover better than kind of just hoping that those things would come to pass. So I think that there's more momentum in that space than I've ever seen before. Not just because someone makes me do govern things, but now, oh yeah, there's that thing in the middle. How do I do that thing in the middle? I think is the pursuit right now.
No, that's fair. And I guess that's one thing. I'm not always in agreement with healthcare organizations. I don't always feel like they're doing, all the safeguards, all the hygiene that I'd love them to do. But I guess I've always had the sense that the healthcare companies that I've been working with, they seem to have a decent structure in place for the governance side of it. They may not always want to do some of the hard hygiene items, but I do feel like they're willing to sort of put processes in place to make sure they're governing it. And I don't know, I guess I maybe I don't give healthcare companies enough credit for that. But I guess at the same time, I'd say, boy, if you were a healthcare company today and you didn't have strong executive sponsorship, or you didn't have a steering committee that was going to help provide oversight for this, or basically, let's just say structures in place that help you align really what the things are that we're doing from a technology standpoint with the overall mission, And again, like you said, I know we've always made a big deal about, again, people's lives are at stake, and this is something that we need to take seriously. But I guess if we don't have that alignment, certainly I would encourage a healthcare organization to make sure you've put those things in place. And I know one of the things that obviously we've been working on here is that over at CRF has been that GRC roadmap. I know we sort of used Dave Ramsey as an example for a little bit. You want to sort of give people the backstory on that, or sort of where that came from?
Yeah, and not just kind of things we know in our brain, but my wife and I have been married almost 30 years. When we first got married, we had some debt and weren't really financially where we needed to be. But so we literally took the kind of Dave Ramsey's class of how to get out of debt and all those things. But he calls them the baby step. He got to start step one, put $1,000 in the bank for your baby emergency fund so that when your car breaks down, you don't have to go in further debt. It's his idea. But we took that example not to get out of debt. We said, what if we took that model that everyone in the world probably knows about, and whether you like him or not, point is there's a process. What if we took a process and made a specific process, a 7-step process that gives us a roadmap to say, not how do I be busy and go to a bunch of meetings and go to a bunch of committee meetings and just kind of be busy, but how do I make sure that I'm going through and sometimes starting momentum and then building upon that momentum throughout those different 7 steps, and not from a thou shalt go to step one before I go to step two, but maybe even doing a risk assessment. Gosh, maybe even the afternoon, you could look at these 7 steps that say, here's the things to be doing. And maybe you're already doing some of those things. And you can give yourself a pat on the back because you did those things, but maybe you don't have a committee, or maybe you don't have a inventory of the things that you know are obligated to do. And you could work on those and be able to self-assess, hey, where am I on this continuum of these baby steps in our GRC roadmap? I look at it all. I'm actually looking at my other screen right now, the different steps and the things, the steps and sub steps that say, what does it look like to be able to leverage that? And you think about, when I was privileged to be the CISO for the Atlanta Fed, I was leading a whole bunch of people, very large team, very important mission. But I would often say, hey, next 2 years, here's where I want to go. Here's where we are. There's where we need to be. That same idea of what if I had a plan and I can look at that plan or maybe evaluate plans I have against this model, the GRC roadmap map, and then uh, borrow from it or perhaps even just adopt it. If you don't have a plan, use this plan. Again, free, it's open source method to evaluate and be intentional about doing our things. I think it's what excites me the most. There's not a day I'm not looking at or advising or talking about or teaching. Your 419 and 519 classes that talk about how to leverage those particular steps.
Well, in fact, if you have that slide up, do you want to share that and see if we can't share that with the community? We'll see if our technology works. Might have to get Rich and all the folks here to kind of give us a hand to get it up there. But if you've got that, let's see if we can show folks. That way we're not sort of talking theoretically.
Yeah, let's just see.
We'll see if all of our fancy technology here works, and we can actually share our presentations here on the screen.
Find that real quick. I think that's. I'm certain it's possible.
While he's doing that, I'll give a little backstory too while he's bringing that up. I guess that's the thing for me. I go back to that wizardry comment. I feel like we've been having these conversations. I feel like literally we've been talking to healthcare facilities and having these conversations, and frankly, even doing these healthcare forums for goodness, it feels like a very long time. And I think a lot of the things that we've been sort of sharing on, I guess more and more that we do this, I feel like it's not rocket science what we're trying to accomplish. And don't get me wrong, I definitely feel like the threats that we're facing they change, right? There's adaptations and the way the threats run change, and certainly there's new technologies out there we have to consider. Obviously, everyone's going to talk about AI and different things and how those relate. But one of the things I guess that's always impressed me, one of the projects I guess that I've always related to was what the Australian government did with the ASD, or originally the ACSC group in Australia. And for those of you who hadn't seen that project, I think nowadays they call it the Essential 8, and back then they called it the Top 35 project. But basically what they did was they went and looked at all of the different attacks against the Australian government. And they said, okay, what are all of the things that we've observed over the last, I don't know, I think 18 months was the original when they did it back in 2009. And they said, what are the things that we actually see, as attacks and what could we have done to have blocked those? And they actually ran statistics on it. A data-driven approach was actually kind of cool. But ever since they released that original study, they've had a few things. They had what they call their sweet spot in those early years. So first, the top 4 safeguards that they think would make a difference. And the thing that's always struck me is that those safeguards have been relatively consistent for, what is it now, 16 plus years. That again, here are the core things that we know we need to do if we're going to be successful. And it's not just technology. I think to Russell's point, especially as we're dealing with things like program management, we're dealing with things like how do we as organizations create a governance, let's say, structure around what we're doing as it relates to cyber. This part especially, I feel like at least, has been pretty consistent. And I know that was one of the things that Russell and I talk about a lot. We talked about those baby steps, and again, like Dave Ramsey or not, I think that theory of a step-by-step approach really kind of resonated with me, at least. And I think one of the challenges that we had too is we were talking about risk management principles and how do we, where does risk management fit? I think one of the things that we were finding was that we were trying to do risk management in a bubble and divorce it from the what we see here on the slide as far as looking at governance. And I think we were trying to say risk management is only one thing, when the reality is we sort of look at the steps in the GRC lifecycle that we've identified, the roadmap here, that there's a couple different places where you see risk management overlay this. And maybe the initiate step is pretty consistent, maybe not a lot of risk management there. But when you get into things like trying to understand and understand the environment, inventory what's there, try to select safeguards, well, now you've got processes like business impact analysis. Now you got things like safeguard selection processes, which are both different forms, what I would consider different forms of threat modeling that feed into risk management processes. And then, of course, where most of us spend our time when we're talking about risk management is that validate step, and certainly there's a lot of overlap there. And I guess, Russell, when you're seeing people go through these steps, and we won't read these to everybody. I mean, certainly you can go online and download the white papers for free. But as you're seeing people go through this, I mean, are you seeing people in healthcare consistently doing each of these steps? Do you see some steps where they're doing better than others? What sort of feedback do you see out there today?
Yeah, I think that there's this opportunity to self-assess. I mean, you could look at this, and on our next slide, it kind of shows a little bit more details about kind of what are the components that are there, like initiate. If there's a charter, like here's a 2-page document that says, here's what we think we need to be doing. Here's what a committee said. Yep, those are the things to do. Fantastic. Give yourself you've earned a pretty green checkbox to get that, but maybe you don't have a steering committee. Maybe you don't report to them on a regular basis. One of those sub items under initiate, be able to, hey, what would it look like? What would have to be true to have that in place before the year's over? I mean, conversations like that with your boss or your committees or your chief medical officers or whomever may be there that could maybe convene on those items, or looking at this idea we mentioned it earlier and under inventory. What laws do I have to follow? What obligations do I have? And what are those good things I know that need to be done, from a collection and inventory of the things that we need to be doing, selecting those things and being intentional about, yeah, it really is a good idea to patch or monitor or log, have instant response or whatever it might be. And then going through selecting and then education, doing the hard thing. I mean, the actual doing it is step 5 of implementing, but then getting to the validation, not just saying, I have a CrowdStrike license if that's your EDR of choice, but validating that CrowdStrike is active and running on every one of your endpoints where it's supported. That validation of not just paying your bill to a security vendor, but making sure you're getting full value from that financial and time investment to give yourself the validation or assurance that those things are working as effective and doing their job, not just, I hope it's there and it should be there and I installed it a long time ago and therefore it must still be there. And then getting that communicate side to how to communicate to a chief nursing officer, chief medical officer, a respiratory therapist, clinical providers, clinicians who are running the healthcare enterprise, but still need to manage that risk. You know, since cyber is a top risk, how can you, as a cybersecurity professional in a healthcare setting, communicate to non-tech, non-cyber executives who understand and deal with risk all the time? They just don't have the vocabulary. They don't care anything about NIST so much as you need to translate into whether mission, vision, values, or kind of get what hangs in the balance from a regulatory requirement to help them understand, help them advise and guide, and help them make a more informed risk-based decision of, to do different things or to improve or to invest in increasing the odds that the company can achieve its goals. It's kind of the opportunities that I see there day in, day out, especially in healthcare.
Yeah, that's fair. I guess the thing too is I mentioned earlier that I feel like a lot of the healthcare groups we work with, I mean, they're pretty good just because there was regulatory focus, for so many years. Like we all knew that this was a thing, that there were committees established, and a lot of the companies we've talked to, the executives at least got on board, at least partially, or at least sort of acknowledged the fact that these things needed to be addressed. The one thing I guess I've been seeing that I still struggle with is I feel like a lot of the groups we talk to, they've not really defined clearly what their intentions are, sort of what feeds into this process. And I think if I could say there's one thing that sort of jumped out to me a lot in healthcare, as well as some other industries as well, is that a lot of folks are making assumptions what it is that they need to do, rather than actually say, we believe if we do these things, it's going to help us achieve our mission. And it could be as simple as, like you said, we're going to follow HIPAA. We have to follow HIPAA. That's fine. Or, we agree we're processing credit cards. And so, a lot of these clinical facilities that we've talked to will say, well, let's add PCI to that list.
Mhm.
We know everyone has strong feelings about it, but people will say, what about high trust? Will that, fit into this conversation someplace? But, one of the things that jumped out to me the other day was working with a client is that their board had primarily been working on the CIS controls, which is, how we got involved with the company to begin with. And then it was interesting that maybe a couple of years ago, this is after us working with the company maybe 10 or 15 years, but a couple of years ago, they got a new board member, and the board member said, well, in the previous companies where I'd worked, we'd done the NIST CSF. And so now what I want to see as a board member is I want to understand, how do we all relate against the CSF? Well, that company had never really defined, what their target state was. Was it NIST? Was it CIS? Was it whatever? And so now you've got confusion. And frankly, the steering committee that was responsible, the risk committee they had, they didn't really know where to go with it. And so what they just said, well, let's just do it twice. And that way we'll keep all the board members happy. And whether there could have been maybe a consolidated answer for some of those things. And I guess the other thing, if I know we're going to run out of time here before we know it, but I guess the idea that I like too of looking at something like a GRC roadmap like this is, some of the things that I see companies facing is definitely the corporate side is, how do we pick safeguards? How do we do good hygiene? What are the good things we should be doing to defend against ransomware and all these things that, again, healthcare is concerned about. But the other big one I know is the idea of looking at the product side. So if we're going to bring in a third party, and certainly third party risk management in general, could follow the same life cycle here. But I know I was always put in positions in the facilities I worked for where we had to make go no go decisions, or at least recommendations on particular products. And I guess what I wish I had, back when I was doing this more regularly, was a bit more of a roadmap like this to say, okay, well, what is the process I would follow to help make that recommendation? What are the safeguards that are non-negotiable, that if we bring in this radiology platform, if we bring in this a cardiology platform, whatever it happens to be, and we don't have at least these safeguards in place, then we really just don't feel comfortable, or whatever that issue might be. So I guess I like the idea that organizations have something like this that they could use to apply as a framework around that decision-making process, kind of a step-by-step process, like you said.
Well, the great part too, it's not just I said so because I'm the security wizard, but it's, a nonprofit that creates tools and gives them away, and not just me and you, but so many folks that are on our board that bring their expertise and their discipline into, hey, don't forget about this, and here's how to think about it in that way. That diverse view to anchor to. Not just it's my good idea, but here's this thing, and Sands talks about it. There's some really smart, very skilled folks on the board, nonprofit, bunch of volunteers to help put things like this together to anchor to the more legitimacy or areas for those executives to board members, like you gave the example of, to feel more comfortable and confident in having a solid, proven approach there. I think there's value to do that as well.
No, that's totally fair. I have a feeling Rich is going to jump on and kick us off here any minute. But if you have just another second or two that you could, or there's maybe one or two things you would say to wrap up and kind of let the folks know something you would want them sort of in healthcare to think about, with your background, what would be the thing you'd leave with today?
Yeah, I'd say if at all possible before this week is over. If I could, I'm no one's a boss here at all. But if I was your boss and I could look at you and we could sit around a cup of coffee or a Diet Coke and talk about this, I'd say, hey, before the week's over, take a look at this. It's free. You can download it. It's out there. It's updated every single year. But do a honest and as less bias as possible self-assessment to see how or is your security program at your organization stacking up there, and where you've done a good job. Again, you've earned the pat on the back, well done. And where there's opportunity, don't try to fix everything before the year's over, but find one thing. What would it look like to make one thing true that's false right now with regard to your self-assessment before the year's over? Do that, feel confident about that, and then have a little factory, little machine that goes through and does that very same thing, maybe on an annual basis. Hey, what are we not doing that could be helpful to increase the odds that our company can continue to meet its goals or meet its missions or literally save lives? Have that intentional process, maybe something as simple as a annual or quarterly calendar reminder that says, "Hey, go to the website, take a look at that, do that self-assessment." So not just one time, but moving from information that we share to application, applying that concept would be what I would say. But that's mine, James. I'll counter the same to you. What you if you were the boss of everyone listening to us now live or on the recording, what's one thing that you would offer for them to consider doing?
I like what you're saying there, and I guess I'd reiterate this idea that I like where we are in this stage of history where we don't have to reinvent the wheel. That there've been a lot of good folks in our industry working together for a lot of years. I mean, certainly SANS has been a big part of this for a long time, and providing feedback to the community and resources that are out there. I know one of the projects we haven't talked about, we probably go on all afternoon about some of this stuff, but the new security policy templates that we published at SANS here earlier this year that are have a new update cycle to them. I mean, if you're trying to reinvent the wheel and you're not taking advantage of some of these resources, I would highly encourage you. There's a lot of really good free stuff, like Russell mentioned. If you go to the SANS security policy templates, if you go to over at CRF, some of the stuff we're releasing, use it. But it's only going to be useful if you use it yourself. Free resources are great, but you have to actually take advantage of yourself. So take a look at those things if you haven't done that yet.